guys, how's it going? Welcome to week number 5, lesson number 9 for Peter Pan by Barrie. In the last video, unfortunately, the remainder got cut off with about 2 minutes left to go, and so the homework was cut off. But if you want to go back to the last video, inside of that video description, I asked you guys to read chapter 8 for homework. And chapter 8 was all about the Mermaid's Lagoon. So if you haven't done that yet, go ahead and do it. And if you have done it, we're just going to go over a quick review where in Mermaid's Lagoon, Peter and the Lost Boys essentially get into a scuffle with Captain Hook and 2 of his pirates. The scuffle doesn't last too awful long, and Peter ends up wounded. The other Lost Boys get away, but Peter and Wendy are on the Marooner's Rock awaiting death until luckily a kite comes, brushes against Peter, he ties it to Wendy, and she floats off to safety, and Peter Pan is left potentially to die on Marooner's Rock. We're going to pick up here on chapter 9, The Never Bird, and we'll probably also read part of chapter 10. If you want to follow along with today's reading, please go to the video description right below this video. It's like right there. It says show more, the description. There's a link in there. Click the link and it'll take you to the book, and you can go down to chapter 9 once you finish chapter 8. Because we're going to pick up here on chapter 9, The Never Bird. The last sound Peter heard before he was quite alone were the mermaids retiring one by one to their bedchambers under the sea. He was too far away to hear their doors shut. Every door in the coral caves where they live rings a tiny bell when it opens or closes, as in all the nicest houses on the mainland. And he heard those bells. Steadily the waters rose till they were nibbling at his feet, and to pass the time until they made their final gulp, he watched the only thing on the lagoon. He thought it was a piece of floating paper, perhaps part of the kite, and wondered idly how long it would take to drift ashore. Presently he noticed as an odd thing that it was undoubtedly out upon the lagoon with some definite purpose, for it was fighting the tide, and sometimes even winning. And when it won, Peter, always sympathetic to the weaker side, could not help clapping. It was such a gallant piece of paper. But it was not really a piece of paper at all. It was the Never Bird, making desperate efforts to reach Peter on the nest. By working her wings in a way she had learned since the nest fell into the water, she was able to some extent to guide her strange craft. But by the time Peter recognized her, she was very exhausted. She had come to save him, to give him her nest, though there were eggs in it. I rather wonder at the bird, for though he had been nice to her, he had also sometimes tormented her. I can suppose only that, like Mrs. Darling and the rest of them, she was melted because he had all his first teeth. She called out to him what she had come for, and he called out to her what she was doing there. But of course, neither of them understood the other's language. In fanciful stories, people can talk to the birds freely, and I wish for the moment I could pretend that this were such a story and say that Peter replied intelligently to the Never Bird. But truth is best, and I want to tell you only what really happened. So, let me pause right there to say again, we know by now that J.M. Barrie likes to break the fourth wall quite often. In this case, he's breaking the fourth wall in a really funny way, because he's breaking it to give us some information. And typically when narrators break the fourth wall, we take them to be relatively truthful because they're telling us something direct. And so we know as readers that the author wants us to actually know something. Usually when they break the fourth wall, it's really so that we have good, useful, efficient knowledge. In this case, it's really interesting that he breaks the fourth wall in order to say that this is not a fanciful story, or at least to allude to that. Because again, right here he says, in fanciful stories, people can talk to the birds freely. And I wish, for the moment, I could pretend that this were such a story and say that Peter replied intelligently to the Never Bird. But truth is best, and I want to tell you only what really happened. So here, J.M. Barrie reveals that even breaking the fourth wall, he is not a fully reliable narrator. And he does that because we know, at least we're pretty darn sure, that Peter Pan, this tale, is not actually nonfiction. That none of this really happened, that this is a fictional fairy tale-like story. People don't usually fly. There isn't a such thing as Neverland. or mermaids or things like that. Or maybe there are, and maybe only J.M. Barrie knows about it. But at least as far as you and I know, there's no such thing. Yet J.M. Barrie seems to insist that this is a true tale. And so there is some importance in this. It's not for no reason. By saying that this tale is actually truth, and saying that he doesn't want to lie, he wants to keep everything as true as possible, J.M. Barrie is doing something very efficient for getting a theme or a moral or a motif across in a story. The more we take this story for fantasy, let's pretend that you and I are reading this story in a group and we're 5 years old. Let's say we're at a daycare, we're 5 years old, and we're reading this story with our teacher. We're going to believe a lot of this. We don't know if Neverland is real or not. We don't know if Peter Pan is real or not. Maybe Peter Pan's real. And so by believing it more and more, we're going to really take the lessons to heart. Now, once we stop believing in it, let's say we turn 12 or 13 or 14 and we know Peter Pan's probably just a character in a movie and not real, we might not take the lessons to heart as much. J.M. Barrie knows this, and he knows that the audience for the book can be anywhere from quite young, 4 or 5 or 6 years old, to maybe a little older, like 12 or 13 or 14. And so in order to keep the lessons as piercing and truthful as possible, J.M. Barrie writes it so that the story isn't quite fantasy. Okay, the idea is like, oh, maybe it is actually real, and maybe the lessons do actually matter. And so as we're reading, just pay attention, because I think J.M. Barrie does truly care about the morals and lessons in this story. And the same way he wants us to believe that it's real, he wants us to believe that the morals are also very real. And truth be told, they probably are. Okay, let's continue. We'll finish chapter 9. I want you to get into the nest, the bird called, speaking as slowly and distinctly as possible. And then you can drift ashore, but I am too tired to bring it any nearer, so you must try to swim to it. What are you quacking about? Peter answered. Why don't you let the nest drift as usual? I want you, the bird said, and repeated it all over. Then Peter tried slow and distinct. What are you quacking about? He said, and so on. The Neverbird became irritated. They have very short tempers. You dunder-headed little jay, she screamed. Why don't you do as I tell you? And Peter felt that she was calling him names, and at a venture he retorted hotly, So are you! Then rather curiously, they both snapped out the same remark. Shut up! Nevertheless, the bird was determined to save Peter if she could, and by one last mighty effort she propelled the nest against the rock. Then up she flew, deserting her eggs so as to make her meaning clear. At last Peter understood, and he clutched the nest and waved his thanks to the bird as she fluttered overhead. It was not to receive his thanks, however, that she hung there in the sky. It was not even to watch him get into the nest. It was actually to see what he did with her eggs. You see, there were 2 large white eggs, and Peter lifted them up and reflected. The bird covered her face with her wings so as not to see the last of them, but she could not help peeping between the feathers. I forgot whether I told you that there was a stave on the rock, driven into it by some buccaneers of long ago to mark the site of buried treasure. The children had actually discovered the glittering treasure, and when in a mischievous mood, used to fling showers of Mordors, diamonds, pearls, and pieces of 8 to the gulls, who pounced upon them for food and then flew away, raging at the scurvy trick that had been played upon them. The stave, however, was still there, and on it starkly had hung his hat, a deep tarpaulin, watertight, with a broad rim. Peter put the eggs into this hat, and then set the hat on the lagoon. It floated beautifully. The Neverbird saw at once what he was up to, and screamed her admiration of him, and alas, Peter crowed his agreement with her. Then he got into the nest, reared the stave in it as a mast, and hung his shirt up for a sail. At the same moment, the bird fluttered down upon the hat and once more sat snugly on her eggs. She drifted in one direction and was borne off in another, both cheering. Of course, when Peter landed, he beached his bark, which is a small ship, and in this particular case, the Neverbird's nest, and he beached it in a place where the bird would easily find it. But the hat was such a great success that she abandoned the nest. It drifted about till it went to pieces, and often Starkey came to the shore of the lagoon and with many bitter feelings watched the bird sitting on his hat. As we shall not see the never bird again, it may be worth mentioning here that all never birds now build in that shape of nest, with a broad brim on which the youngsters take an airing. Great were the rejoicings when Peter reached the home under the ground almost as soon as Wendy, who had been carried hither and thither by the kite. Every boy had adventures to tell, but perhaps the biggest adventure of all was that they were several hours late for bed. This so inflated them that they did various dodgy things to get staying up still longer, such as demanding bandages. But Wendy, though glorying in having them all home again safe and sound, was scandalized by the lateness of the hour, and she cried, "To bed, to bed!" in a voice that had to be obeyed. Next day, however, she was awfully tender, and gave out bandages to every one of the lost boys, and they played till bedtime at limping about and carrying their arms in slings. So that's the end of chapter 9. Chapter 9 is really fascinating. Peter is really compassionate there, right? So it's something that we get to learn. We get to take it as a lesson. We get to go, J.M. Barrie really wants us to believe the story's real. If this story's real, what's the lesson? The lesson is to be compassionate. And when others give you a helping hand, do your best to help them back. Kind of like a quid pro quo kind of thing. And so we take that moral to heart and we say, well, maybe the moral is real. And it dawns upon us. Cool. So chapter 9 is nice. It's a nice little escape from Peter's death. And it's also a really good storytelling technique as far as keeping the plot interesting. Because here we have a new conflict that was brief, and it follows the plot pyramid just the same as the entire book follows it. So let's investigate that really quickly. In the beginning of the book, we have exposition for the plot period, or the plot pyramid. So let me grab a pen. I'll be right back. Okay, so let's take another look at Freytag's plot pyramid. Okay, so we have exposition, we have rising action, we have the climax, we have falling action, and then we have a conclusion. So let's take a quick look at that. Here we have Freytag's plot pyramid. In this plot pyramid, exposition right here is the beginning part of a story that tells us the nature of what's going to happen. So it gives us the first characters, it gives us the setting, the time period, the place, right? It gives us all the things that we need to know, or the ingredients, you could say, for the making of the story. Then, as things start to occur and there's conflict, we have rising action. It's when the story starts to get quite interesting. Crazy things happen, heroes go on adventures, and so forth. And in this case, the exposition would have been the introduction of Wendy and John and Michael, and even Mr. and Mrs. Darling and Nana, and also Peter Pan. The rising action would have been when Peter Pan took Wendy and John and Michael out. After the rising action, we have the climax, which maybe we've gotten to and maybe not. We'll have to investigate that later. But the climax is the craziest part of the book, the part of the book that is just wild, and it usually contains the nugget of morality or thematic development or any other thing that the book is truly trying to express. After that, we have falling action, which is a brief portion in the latter half of the book that allows things to slowly get back to sort of what we know as normal, or at least the new normal. And then lastly, we have the conclusion. Now, we haven't gotten to the falling action or the conclusion of this story yet. The conclusion, as you guys probably know, is the ending, where things have changed and become far different from here, the exposition. the characters go through this journey and they come out differently. And we too, as readers, go through a journey and learn new lessons and come out differently at the end. So, J.M. Barrie follows the plot pyramid quite well in general throughout the book, but you can also do the plot pyramid in brief chapters to keep things interesting. So here in the Mermaid Lagoon chapter, we also have use of the plot pyramid. We have the exposition of explaining the fact that they're at this lagoon for an adventure. We have the rising action when we see the two pirates and Captain Hook come to leave the chief's daughter out to die. We have the climax where Peter and the Lost Boys and even kind of Wendy get into a fight with Hook and the two pirates. Peter's wounded and left to die. And then we have falling action as Peter finds a way off of the rock to survive. And lastly, we have a conclusion where everyone ends up home and safe from the adventure and has learned something from it. Now, as we know from the many times J.M. Barrie expresses that Peter forgets things, we don't really think Peter is going to learn anything from this. Peter will just go on adventure after adventure, no matter what happens. And that's why he remains a child. But we, as growing humans who do age and don't remain children forever, we will learn something from this. Probably Wendy will also learn something from this, and so might John and Michael, and some of the other Lost Boys who also age. What we learn is going to be far different from what Wendy learns or what John or Michael learn maybe, and it's definitely going to be a far cry more than what Peter will ever learn. And so because of that, I would actually love for this to be the homework assignment for the week. So we're not going to dive into chapter 10. We're going to leave it there at chapter 9. And I would like for you to, going through the plot pyramid that I described of chapter 8 and 9, where we have exposition, rising action, climax, falling action, and conclusion, I would love for you to define for me what one of the lessons is, one of the morals is from this particular adventure. There will be themes as well, and remember, a theme is different from a moral. A moral, or the moral of a story, is usually a lesson that we can take away, like don't speak to strangers, or treat others the way you want to be treated, things like that. Whereas themes are larger ideas that are developed in the story, like friendship is a theme, or deceit is also a theme. So we're not looking for themes right now. Rather, I'd like you to look for the moral of these two chapters based off of the way the plot pyramid goes on. So you don't need to do any large amount of writing. Really, all you have to do is find a moral and have something prepared that explains how you know that moral is what it is. That I know you're not just making it up, and you're actually drawing it from the events in the story. It can be a paragraph, or maybe only a few sentences, or maybe a 5-page essay, whatever makes you happiest. And then in the next reading, we'll pick up at chapter 10, okay? All right, if you have any questions, feel free to come to my Zoom hours, and you can share the homework there as well. They're every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday in the morning from 8:30 to 9 a.m., and in the afternoon from 2 to 2:30 p.m. You can also email me if you have any questions. And don't forget to keep doing the homework and watching these videos, because it gets you entered into that $25 drawing at the end of every week. So with nothing left to go over, I hope you guys have a wonderful day. I'll catch you on the Zoom call soon. And if not, I'll see you on Thursday for the next video. Bye, guys.